Hello and welcome back to What's Your History, the podcast that covers all areas of history and archaeology, no matter how big or how small, how well known or how niche. Today's guest was Gabriel Garcia. He has a Master's in History from the University of San Francisco, and he was speaking to me today about the Roman Battle of Cannae. We also covered an alternative ending to this battle, and I do hope you enjoy. It's not something I know much about. I'm not a clinical historian, but Gabriel is, so I do hope you enjoy this episode. What is it about this Roman battle that got you interested? Why do you want to talk about it? Yeah, all the things, really.
All right, so the Battle of Cannae is probably one of the most interesting battles in the early Republic history of Rome. Now, people really have to understand, at this time, which is 216 BC, Rome is still in its infancy. It's not the global superpower that we know it in the history books, but it's on the rise. It's starting to establish itself in the Mediterranean world. And why that battle is so important is the only other rival to Rome at this period in history are the Carthaginians. Now, for those who may not know who the Carthaginians are, they are a Phoenician empire or Phoenician descent empire that established itself in North Africa. The Phoenicians were a seafaring people who established colonies all across the North African region, as well as southern Spain, and quite possibly southern Gaul, and possibly even Britannia. And the Carthaginians specialized in naval warfare. They also used a mercenary army, and they were known as the wealthiest empire at the time. The problem is you have an established kingdom, and then you also have the newcomer, the underdogs, the Romans. And why the Battle of Cannae is so important is you had a series of wars. The first was the Punic Wars, which, of course, Rome won, and established a series of terms that the Carthaginians had to follow. The Carthaginians didn't really like that because it hindered their navy, and they are seafaring people, and they need their navy to not only conduct trade and business, but it's also their main source of defense. That is their military. They do have the mercenary army, but they only use that for dire situations. The navy is the premier military defense of the Carthaginians. And as such, to rebuild their economy, the Carthaginians under Hannibal of the Barcas decides to go into Iberia, into Spain, because Spain has silver. And that silver is used to jumpstart, or I should say re-jumpstart, the Carthaginian economy. And Rome kind of gets word of this, because they also have a colony, or rather a city, in Iberia called Saguntum. Well, Hannibal decides, you know what? I think Rome needs to be put back in its place. And it's actually at that Battle of Saguntum that really kind of establishes the message that Carthage has. We're coming, we're going to destroy you, and we're going to take our place. And after a series of battles where Carthage wins, after crossing the Alps, we now get to Cannae. Now, to set the stage, Rome has lost a lot of men. They've gone through a series of military leadership changes. Now they have two consuls, which consuls are sort of men of power who come in dire situations. And what also must be noted is that the Roman military is not a standing army as we know it in later history. It is an army where you fight in the summer and autumn, and you don't fight in the spring, because that's usually the cultivation of the crops. So their army is primarily based around the seasons. Well, when Hannibal invades, it's at the worst possible time for the Romans. It's during, to my knowledge and to my research, it's in the spring. It's in the spring, and that's when Rome has to get all of its able-bodied men to fight and retrain. And while that's happening, there's no one tending the fields, there's no one tending the crops, so all that harvest is going to waste. And at Cannae, Rome fights Hannibal. And it's at that battle that Hannibal shows his military genius, which is known as the double envelopment. So to set the stage as best I can, so let's say this hand right here represents Hannibal's army, and the other hand represents the Roman army. Now, the Roman army is attacking, and there's a thin line of Carthaginian troops. Now, the Carthaginian front begins to curve in, begins to fold, and begins to move all the way back. Well, Rome thinks they're winning. They're actually going to beat Hannibal. They don't realize that they fell into Hannibal's trap. Hannibal uses this double envelopment to pretty much create a box. So now you have his heavy infantry, Hannibal's heavy infantry, which consists of Celtic-Iberians attacking the flanks of Rome. And to the horror of the Romans, their sides are also getting enclosed in. So now you have almost like, the best I can show is like a box. They are now in a box. They can't get out because they're constantly being driven forward. They can't turn around. They can't move their shields. 75,000 Romans died in 6 hours. To put that in perspective, this is the ancient times. So you are up close and personal with swords, spears, early axes, possibly bare hands and rocks, to kill 75,000 Romans in 6 hours is a selling point. And Rome is truly on the brink of collapse because they have no army to defend themselves. Now, historically, Rome eventually does come out on top in the end because of one crucial thing. People have to realize that the Carthaginian aristocracy has almost like a check and balance. You have the military and you have the government. The government keeps the warlords or the military in check. And the aristocracy, the elite in Carthage, were seeing Hannibal as kind of like a warmonger. He's getting too powerful. So we need to halt his supplies in Spain, because that is where Hannibal is getting most of his supplies from his brothers, Hamilcar and Mago, or Hasdrubal and Mago. They're still with him, and their forces are still in Spain. So since they cut him off in Spain, he now has to go back to get that stuff. That is the saving grace for Rome to recover. Because had Hannibal gotten the supplies he needed, he would have easily taken Rome. And the Western world as we know now would have been vastly different.
So if, say in this hypothetical world that he didn't do that, what would have really have been the outcomes then? Because you said it would have been completely different. What do you think it would have been like?
I'm actually glad you brought that up. And with me, I actually have my notes with me that I'm going to read off. So, if Hannibal actually had won the war, if he actually got the supplies from Spain to not only pay his mercenary force, but to feed his army, they would have not only had enough fresh troops, but they would have gained divine status for the people of Carthage. And the Barcas would have become the most politically and militarily powerful family in all of Carthage. And with the military family in charge, Carthage would now invest more into a land-based army. They would still have their mercenary army, but they would now develop a possible pseudo-standing-based army to protect their interests. And under the Barcas, Carthage would conquer the rest of Iberia because that was their primary goal. They didn't really conquer all of Iberia. They conquered maybe a quarter of it, a fraction of it. They would have consolidated their full power in Iberia and made sure that all that money was still theirs. But it must be noted that the Carthaginian and Roman expansion are very different in their approach to their neighbors. Now, as you know in history, Rome is a militaristic society built upon by combat. and the rulers are shaped by war. Carthage, as I mentioned before, is an economic society that prefers trade and money over fighting with its enemies, because trade would allow them, or I should say, force them to raise taxes to buy mercenaries. And Carthage really doesn't want to do that. They want to establish trade partners, because if they can work with you via gold, that's fine in their books. And that would make them get more allies, because it makes more sense. The Carthaginians are businessmen to their core. And they wouldn't go about conquering and subduing Gaul, Germania, like the Romans did. Their strategy would have always been to avoid wars, because wars cost money. And they would use their economy to establish their position rather than use their military force. They could use it, but they could pretty much tell their enemies, we have the money, we have the time. You can't beat us, so just work with us to avoid further bloodshed. And the empire would have been a maritime empire, and the army would be used in extreme cases. Now, the Carthaginian expansion would have gone south into the continent of Africa, because it is theorized that the Carthaginians, as explorers, already had knowledge of other African societies and communities on the continent. So most likely they would have gone south. They probably would have gone through the Strait of Gibraltar, go along the side of West Africa, and establish trade agreements with the various African kingdoms down south. And as such, the idea of Pax Romana would not be in existence. You could argue Pax Carthage, but I use that term loosely, because Carthage wasn't interested in fully dominating its neighbors. It had no interest in forcing its neighbors to adopt their religion. They would have allowed Gaul to establish its identity, and Germania would have gone into Gaul fully, because they were already at that time. So in the north, you have had a lot of polytheistic religions fighting for control in the Celtic world. And for Rome specifically, the Phoenician alphabet would have gradually taken over Latin, because that was the established language the Carthaginians were speaking. And the Phoenician alphabet would have also been used as well. More so, just looking beyond Rome, the rest of the world would be vastly, vastly different. We know that Christianity does emerge later in the early imperial era of Rome. But here's where it gets different. Because Rome as a military power does not exist, Greece and the rest of the Greek cities unite together and join the Balkans. And they now consolidate their region in Anatolia and the Greek world. In addition, the Parthians fully control the Seleucid Empire, and their kingdom goes all the way to Judea, Syria, possibly even down to Egypt. As such, Christianity doesn't really take its shape, because the crucifixion was a Roman punishment, and the idea of the cross would not exist. Christianity would have still existed in this world, but have taken on a very small role and played no major integral issue in history. If the followers of Jesus lived in this world, they would have been Parthian citizens. And it is theorized they may not have been persecuted. They probably would have been tolerated by the Parthians. Mm-hmm. And in addition, Christianity would have gone east. They wouldn't have gone west. They would have gone to try to spread Christianity into India, possibly China, and maybe even up north. Now this leads into the other one. What about Islam? What about the Arab kingdom?
Yeah.
Well, you have two possible outcomes. Let's say Islam does emerge. We have to think, well, what is the strength of the Parthians or Sasanians who emerge, depending on what happens? Do the Greeks and the Sasanians fight back? If they do, then the Arabs may try to go into North Africa. But here's the problem. By the time Islam emerges, it's in like the late antiquities, early medieval period. Carthage, in this hypothetical scenario, is probably the most powerful empire. It's already established itself. It probably already has Egypt from the Ptolemies. So they are already dominant. They're not going to allow anyone. So, if they can't go up, if they can't go west, the logical conclusion is south into Africa. So the Arabs would have gone deep into Africa. And the idea of what we consider the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Fatimids would have taken on a greatly different shape because now they are going into the rest of the continent of Africa, as well as moving away from the Carthaginians. That is one theory. The second theory, if the Greeks are not as strong, then possibly Islam could have gone north. But here's where we run into the problem. In the north, as you know geographically, the people there rely on two things that historically the followers of Islam, and to my knowledge, would have a hard time adjusting to. Number one is alcohol. Because in the frozen north, you need alcohol to consume to keep your body warm. Now, I don't know much about Islamic history rather than the broad sense from what I've learned, but alcohol is something that is not prohibited in the practice of Islam. Also, pork is something that is also not allowed in the teachings of Islam from my own research and my own understanding. So it would have had a hard time adjusting. It possibly may have died out. It may have stayed just in the Anatolian region and possibly Syria, Judea, and what we know as the Levant region. It's hard to say. And that would have greatly changed the Western world because now we jump forward to the Renaissance. What we conceive as the Renaissance is not in Europe. It's in the Mediterranean, which is Spain, southern Italy, and North Africa. That is the melting pot. It's not Europe. And it is possibly theorized that if the Carthaginians were still in power after that battle, if they had dominated the Mediterranean world, established their Carthaginian African empire, it is theorized that they would have gone exploring west, leading to the Americas. In that sense, Carthage, in theory, could have established trade agreements with the Mesoamericans of South America, possibly relations with the Inca, and if they went to Central America, possibly trade agreements with the Aztec. Because, as I said, the Carthaginians are not interested in dominating the world. They want to have a presence in the world through trade. Well, let me rephrase it. They want to dominate the world, but not through military, not through violence, not through bloodshed. That is the Roman way. They are solely interested in business. If they can dominate the world through business, they will be the most powerful maritime empire in the world. But that is just one theory. There was a lot of different ways that this could have gone on. But that is why this battle is so important. Because if Rome fell in 216 BC, pretty much, most likely, modern day people from England would have possibly been speaking the Phoenician alphabet with a little bit of Celtic. the Americas will probably have like a mix of their own native languages with a little bit of Phoenician. It would have been vastly different.
And so what made you want to research this? What was it about this particular battle that made you go, I need to look into this in more detail and the outcomes and the potential outcomes, and what drew you to this battle?
Well, what drew me to this battle was actually from writing. So for those who know me or for those who don't know, besides history, I'm also a writer. I write my own books. And kind of where this idea came from actually stems from one major book that I wrote 5 years ago, or took 5 years, which was The Gathering, which is an historical fantasy sci-fi story which takes individuals from pinnacle battles in history and places them in a fantasy world. Now, I don't want to spoil things too much, but there is a plot point, which if you've seen me on other podcasts or on my own channel, The Wandering Scribe, the plot point of The Gathering is if a character from The Gathering goes back to their time of summoning, they create an alternate world. And that's where the idea stemmed from, the idea of this what if. And the first character I explored this is the first character, Amanus Baru, a Greek from the Battle of Plataea. And that's where I explore a Greek world under the Persian Empire in Amanus, son of Persia, which that also shows a very different world where now Persia has control of Greece, but Greece still has its identity. They're just under new management because the Persian Empire is already a multicultural, multi-diverse empire while still showing loyalty to the Persian elite. So democracy was still gone to Rome. The ideas of what we know as democracy was still gone to Rome. The languages would have still been the same, and all of that would have still been Greece, just under new management, as I said. Now, the next character, which leads into this battle of Cannae, is Decimus Aquila, who is from that battle, or a character that I wrote to be a part of that battle. And it's actually from there where I get to really do more research into the huge geopolitical ramifications, because it's that major battle that changes the world. I know people would like to say if Greece fell, then the Western world would have been, changed forever. Not necessarily, because, as I said, democracy and those teachings already went to Rome, so Rome already has that stuff. That is where, if Rome fell, that is a huge thing, because everything we know about Western history, Western civilization, Western culture stems from the Romans. They were the longest ruling empire of the Western world. If they were out of the picture in their infancy, and as I said before, this world we're living in would be vastly different.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I do like what if scenarios about things as well. So you said you did it through your research for your books, but did you get any inkling for this battle beforehand, and like your studies or all like that?
When I've been doing research for this book, I then began to do more research individually, privately, to really hammer in why this battle is so significant. Because when we think of the Roman battles, the wars of early Republic Rome, we tend to think of later in history, 146 BC, maybe 46 BC, and stuff like that. But Cannae is really, really important. And for the average individual who has studied Roman history, they'll know, okay, Cannae was a huge battle because it would have led to the destruction of Rome. But if you really look at the history and the connection and the webs interwoven, this battle is truly Rome's, death sentence. If they truly lost, Hannibal marched onto Rome, it would have been catastrophic. It would have been the end of Rome, or rather the Roman identity. Rome still would have existed, but it would have been a colony of the Carthaginian Empire. And when looking at that, I honestly was just amazed by how important this is. Now, regarding as to why Hannibal did not go with the initiative, as I said, one theory is that the Carthaginian aristocracy was holding back supplies in Spain, so he had to abandon his Roman adventure. Other historians argue that Hannibal believed because Rome was pretty much on its knees, that Rome had lost so much, he was under the impression that Rome would come crawling to him. Anyone who knows Roman history, Rome does not want to be anyone's mistress. Rome is not going to lose. So if they're going to be the cockroach that survives, they are. And they did. They held out. And when 146 comes in, which is the Third Punic War, it is a war of annihilation. Because one Roman individual, who would be known as Scipio Africanus, pretty much burns Carthage, or rather, to use the historical term, salts the earth. He makes it impossible for the Carthaginians to ever establish themselves as a threat to the Republic. And Carthage becomes a colony. Carthage can no longer become its heyday, can become the powerhouse it was before. So after that battle in 146, the invasion of Carthage, it just falls into just another Roman colony. But it's really interesting to see from 216 BC to 146, which is roughly 80 years, give or take. In 80 years, it would have been a vastly different world. In 146, you possibly could have had Carthage invading kingdoms in Africa. You possibly could have had Carthage invading Egypt. You could have had Carthage even invading the Persians, because they already wanted to beat the Persians, or rather the Greeks, because the Greeks aided Sicily and Syracuse, Sicily, during the Greco-Carthaginian Wars, because Syracuse was at one point a Greek colony.
Blimey. Yeah, that's really, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just struggling to really process it all. So I don't have a classical background, so I'm still struggling a little bit with, like, who are the proper key players for this particular battle? You've mentioned the one side that went to get more supplies and things, but I'm not fully understanding who the key players of this battle was.
Of course.
Sorry.
So the main powers of the Battle of Cannae is, of course, Hannibal Barca. Mm-hmm. And to the Romans' credit, where is my book? I have the names actually listed in the chapter of chapter 2, which is, of course, silly me. I must not have listed them.
That's all right.
But Rome does establish 2 consuls to help fight the battle, because Trivia and Tasmia were the 2 battles preceding Cannae, and they already lost those. They were incredibly bad. They lost so many men. So by 216, they've raised 75,000. That is the largest the empire has ever done. And honestly, Hannibal's like the main man. He's the main man in charge. He does have his forces from Carthage. He does have some of the Celtic tribes and the Celtic warriors who have joined up with him through the Alps, because that's really another selling point. He crossed the Alps. No one has ever done that. He did. That established himself as a man on a mission. Yeah. And that mission was to burn Rome to the ground.
And he was pretty close to fulfilling that by the sounds of it.
He was. And also, it must be noted, Hannibal only brought with him 50,000 men. Rome had an advantage of like 20,000 extra troops. So one would argue, number-wise, Rome had the number. But in terms of experience, that was Hannibal. Hannibal had the experience because he was fighting in Spain, he crossed into Gaul, he went into the Alps, and honestly, he was a time-tested commander, general, and warrior.
It sounds pretty impressive that, seeing that they failed two battles, I mean, it's going to happen anyway, and more often than not, I know the Romans don't like to share the stories of their failures. But to sound like it had two failures and they were on the verge of a third, it was only a fluke, by the sounds of it, of how they managed to survive that one. It's pretty impressive to see how they carried on going. Because did you say this was like the very beginning of their empire?
For Rome or for Carthage? For Rome, well, this is the beginning of the Republic. They're starting to establish themselves as a republic, as a presence in the Mediterranean world, because they are the baby. They are the young upstart. So they've had some flukes because they had to establish themselves in the Italian peninsula. Because you had the Latins, you had the Etruscans, you had a lot of other native tribes and people in Rome, and those who become Romans establish themselves as the main force. Now, you can go into a whole story about where the Romans come from. To make a long story short, a lot of historians theorize that they are actually of Greek descent from the Odyssey, as that story goes. Or, if you want to go with the Roman myth, they are the children of Romulus and Remus, and Romulus founds the city of Rome from his namesake.
Yeah.
But regardless of where they came from, Rome and the Romans established themselves as a powerhouse. And they got lucky. They honestly got lucky at Cannae, because had Carthaginian politics not interfered with Hannibal, they would have easily lost. Because they were already sacked before by the Gauls in 400 BC, so they already know they can be taken again. But through history and through sheer luck, it goes their way. And honestly, that's all history is. Sometimes it's by luck, sometimes it's by winners, sometimes it's just by sheer luck of the draw.
Yeah, like the stars aligned.
Yeah. And history is written by the winners, so history went in Rome's favor.
And then that trickled into what we know about the Roman Empire, the growth of it, the fact that it took over most of Europe to the best of their abilities until their eventual collapse, unfortunately, probably about the 400s or 500s.
Yes, that is correct. After defeating Carthage and really getting rid of their sole maritime rival, they now establish themselves as the sole powerhouse in the Mediterranean. You want to deal trade here? You got to come to us. Now, they still had their rivals in Celtic Europe, and we know that Rome would never be able to fully conquer them. But Rome was able to establish a powerful empire, and Rome did steal a lot of stuff from the Carthaginians, especially their ships and the styles of ships that they did, because the Roman navy was not really the best, and honestly, they stole the ideas from Carthage after Carthage became a colony, and it is honestly very, very fascinating. And I also probably want to establish the thing of, when we think of Hannibal, this military general, out of all of the historical figures of that time, he's probably the one individual we probably don't know exactly what he looks like. And what I mean is, we have the busts of him. But even then, we don't know what he looks like, because that is from the Roman interpretation. And so Rome can say whatever they want about him. But it is really, really fascinating to really see this individual.
Yeah. Wonderful. So what was it about classical history that got you interested in wanting to learn more about it?
Initially, I actually didn't want to go into classical history. I was actually wanting to go into Asian history because that was my main interest.
Mm-hmm.
But when I started reading a lot more classical books on Rome and Greece, and when I actually started to enroll in my master's program and enroll into history, I wanted to focus on Asian history. But I took a class in Rome, and one of my professors, shout out to Professor Campbell of San Francisco State, he was my favorite history teacher of all time. And he actually got me into classical history. And that's when I changed my whole plan, where I would be a classical historian. I would study classical antiquities. And I just love it. And I just love researching about Rome. I love researching the what-ifs. I also love exploring its eastern cousin, the Byzantines, or the Eastern Roman Empire, because they are really, really fascinating. And that could be a whole discussion in of itself if the Eastern Reconquest had survived and was able to gather much of the Roman Empire.
Have you had a chance to go to where the battle was or anything like that?
I would love to do that. Unfortunately, I live in the States, and trying to get a ticket to Italy is expensive. So most of my research has just been through documentaries, through books, through images. But to see the battle in the pictures and documentaries, it is really, really fascinating for me. And I also forgot to mention the battle really took its shape in an old documentary series that I remember watching as a kid, which was Battles BC. Now, for those who don't know Battle BC, after the hype of 300, the History Channel decided to make, 6 episodes stylized in that format of the various battles. You had Caesar's Greatest Conquest of Orleans. You had Ramesses, Egypt's greatest pharaoh. You had David the Giant Slayer. You had Joshua and the Siege of Jericho. And, of course, you had the Carthaginian invasion by Hannibal. And that was incredible, and I loved that battle. And that's truly where I got most of my information from. That was the starting point.
Starting point on this journey to classical history and writing your novels and things.
Yes.
Oh, it's really, it's lovely that people, you can have that sort of little connection. I'm sure we've all have our own connections. Like, one of the things I say that I really loved that got me into history full stop was reading a book called Goodnight Mr. Tom, which is a Second World War novel. Nothing to do with what we're talking about, but that's how I got into history, really. So I think I've already asked you, but what is it about this battle in particular that made you want to know more about it, and not about the ones that they lost or anything like that?
Why I think that battle is so important, as I've probably mentioned before, is this was truly the sword that nearly killed Rome. This battle is truly the deciding factor if Rome would have a presence in the Mediterranean world. Arguably, in either scenario, Rome loses that battle. There is no escape from it. Rome loses that battle. It's what happens after that battle, which is very, very important. The many factors. If Carthage gave the supplies, or if Hannibal got the supplies from his siblings, Hasdrubal and Mago, they would have been able to continue the war. They didn't. And that gave Rome the saving grace to fight on, to fight another day. And that is truly important because in all of my research, a lot of historians talk about this is the what-if scenario. Out of all Roman history, all the what-if battles, what if Rome did not lose at Carthage in 50 BC? What if Rome conquered Britannia in 60 AD? What if Rome did not fall in the 400 or the crisis of the 3rd century didn't happen? Those are all really important, but that's already when Rome establishes itself as a name, as a presence. Cannae establishes Rome as a force. Cannae is what gives the Romans a presence. Had Hannibal continued the momentum, the idea of Rome and what it is to be Roman would not be what we know it to be now. That is why researching this battle is so important, and why to study this battle is really important. And also it's imperative to study the war before, the First Punic War, because that really sets up the Second Punic War. There may not have been a Third Punic War had Hannibal won. There would have been no need, because Rome's already his. But because Rome survived, and they wanted revenge, and we know Rome will always get what it wants, they initiate the Third Punic War.
Wonderful. Oh, this has been really fascinating. Thank you for that. I don't know what else to ask at this moment in time. Is there anything else you feel that people need to know about this battle in particular?
Yes. I definitely think, from what we talked about, the scenarios, the what-ifs, those are all possible solutions.
Mm-hmm.
History is never set in stone. And I think it's important to study this battle and all other battles to see the cracks in between, to see what could have been. Because that is the beautiful thing about history. Yes, history is written by the winners. History is written by the victors. And the victors will always paint their enemies in a bad light or in a negative light to discredit them. But I think it's important as a story is to look beyond that and see what are the sources not telling us. And at the Battle of Cannae, in my research, I realized that, as we mentioned throughout this whole episode, it is the battle that Rome had to survive from. They lose 75,000 men in 6 hours. They truly have no one left to fight. By sheer luck and saving grace, they were able to survive. They were able to persevere. And it's after that battle and the next set of wars in 146 BC that establishes Rome as a presence. They were then able to beat the Greeks. They're then able to conquer Spain. They're then able to consolidate power in Gaul, a little bit in Germania, along the Rhine, Britannia, into North Africa, Egypt, Syria, Judea, all of that. None of this would happen, none of this would exist without Cannae, in my opinion. Cannae is what truly establishes Rome as an empire, or rather, a political powerhouse.
And why do you think so many people don't know about this particular battle? Unless you're like a full-on like classical historian, where you probably do know that. But from like what we learn just in like school or whatever, we never seem to learn about this battle. Like I'd never heard about this until you said you wanted to talk about it.
Of course. I definitely think it's because of the interest of what it has. Because when we think of Rome and the Republic, we think of Caesar, we think of the main powerhouse like Pompey, and all those men who established the Marian reforms, the Julians. All of these people established themselves in the late Republic era, which is where we get most of the research from, especially Cicero and Cato the Elder. All of these men appear in like the middle to late era of the Republic. And that's where we get the most information from, because that's where all the good stuff begins, because it's the late Republic that establishes the Roman Empire. The assassination of Julius Caesar is truly the most interesting thing. It's the image, it's that classical painting where you see Caesar standing on the floors of the Senate trying to stop his attackers. That is encapsulated, that is embedded in our minds. Even if you're not a classical historian, you know about Caesar. You know he was assassinated. But it's the stuff in the early years before Rome has those men that are truly important. And why this battle and many like it are integral to understand the identity of Rome and what it is to be Roman. You can't learn about these figures, these men of power in Roman history, without learning where they come from. And even at times when they lost. In the early Republic, Rome was sacked by the ancient Celts. And Rome was nearly destroyed by the Carthaginians in 216 BC. So 2 times in a span of 200 years, they were nearly destroyed.
And yet we don't seem to learn about that.
No. Or rather, we just tend to look at the Roman side of history where Rome kind of got its revenge and just pretty much made all the enemies their mistresses, their servants, their slaves, and just subservient to Rome.
Well, thank you for this. Is there anything that you would recommend for people who want to look into this further?
Actually, yes, I do. I don't necessarily have the books with me by hand, but actually, I'm going back to my notes because I actually do have some books to look into. If you do want to look at Rome like a general starting point, it would definitely be Mary Beard's CPQR, A History of Ancient Rome, is a very, very fascinating read. I would also recommend David Lecturer's Rome Republic, a very short introduction. I would also like to use Neil Rogers and Hazel Dodge's The Illustrated Encyclopedia of the Roman Empire, a complete history of the rise and fall, because that really shows the history of Rome, the culture, the people, the language. So those books I would highly recommend as starting points. And then I would also look into books on Roman Carthage and Carthaginian history, Hannibal, the Barcas. I would definitely look into sources about them because they are fascinating. And I don't think they get a lot of recognition.
Well, thank you for that. You're very clearly passionate about this, and it's lovely to see. So I'm going to wrap it up now. Sorry, I'm trying to get my words out. Where can people find you?
Of course. So I'm on LinkedIn. If you want to follow my newsletter, it is the Wandering Quill. I'm also on Instagram as Arbiter283. And I also have my YouTube channel. You can also find me there and find my content. That is where I interview historians, authors, have my own series called The Historian's Lounge, where almost something like this, we have a discussion about a historical topic. So you can find me there, and I'll provide all those down below to check me out. And if you want to read my works, they are available on YouTube. The links are. And if you do want to get a jump start into this world, before I write the next book, which is Decimus Rome's Wolf, which talks about this alternate Roman history, I would definitely begin with The Gathering, and then its sequel / spin-off new series, Amanus, Son of Persia. Now, I know a lot of people ask me about Decimus, so I'm going to say it here again right now. I am working on it. It's still in the rough draft phase. It may be out in the next year or so. So I would just have to disrespectfully ask that you guys will have to wait. I know you guys are passionate. For those who have read Amanus, thank you for all the reviews. For those who have read The Gathering, thank you so much. And for those who haven't and are just learning about this for the first time, I urge you all to go and check it out and just share me your feedback, share me your thoughts, because at the end of the day, historians, authors, content creators, we all want to tell our stories. We're very creative people, and we want to help each other.
Thank you. Yeah, I will be putting all the links down below for you guys to check those out and check out his books. Thank you, Gabriel, for appearing on this podcast and telling us about this battle that probably nobody knows about unless they're a classical historian. So it's been very interesting. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Kay. Thank you very much. And again, I hope you enjoyed, listeners. This is probably the most fun I've had on a podcast, getting to talk about classical history, my field of expertise. So thank you all so very much, and I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.